Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Whether we want to admit it or not, those of us who claim to be children of God can often live as if we don't really believe in God. We can acknowledge His existence and express faith in His love for us, but then turn around and make decisions without His input. We can go through the day without giving Him a second thought. And in Joshua chapter 5, verses 1 through 15, we're going to see the Israelites do just that. Even after having built an altar to Him at Mount Ebal, and having recommitted themselves to keeping His law, Joshua and the people of Israel will end up making an alliance with the Gibeonites. Sure, they were tricked into doing it, but the text makes it very clear that Joshua neglected to seek God's advice. He made a decision without divine assistance. Never a wise move for the child of God. And not only would Joshua's ill-advised decision obligate the people of Israel, we'll see that it obligated God, because it was made in His name. For the child of God, leaving Him out of the daily affairs of life is never a good plan. Failing to seek His counsel is a recipe for disaster. Joshua and the people of Israel had successfully conquered 2 Canaanite cities. They had defeated and destroyed Jericho and Ai, and their reputation had already begun to spread. News of these 2 victories had made its way to the surrounding nations, creating a sense of fear in the hearts of their people. And the Israelites had celebrated these 2 victories by traveling to Mount Ebal, where they erected an altar to God and recommitted themselves to the covenant that God had made to Moses on that very same spot. As part of the ceremony at Mount Ebal, Joshua had inscribed the law of Moses on the stones of the altar and had read the words it contained to the people of Israel. Now, there are some who believe that Joshua had written and read the book of Deuteronomy in its entirety. Others believe Joshua limited his writing and recitation to chapters 27 and 28. But his reading of the law would have likely included the blessings and the curses found in Deuteronomy. The law was conditional. It required obedience, and failure to obey came with serious consequences. But obedience would be accompanied by blessing. If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all His commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 through 2. God had promised to go with them and to cause their enemies to flee before them. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before you. They shall come out against you 1 way and flee before you 7 ways. Deuteronomy 28, verse 7. But God had made it clear that if they disobeyed His law, things would not go well for them. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out 1 way against them and flee 7 ways before them. And you shall be a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Deuteronomy 28, verse 25. And one of the key requirements He placed on them was a ban from making treaties or alliances with the people who lived in the land of Canaan. Little by little I will drive them out before you, until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Exodus 23, verses 30 through 33. God not only required their full obedience to His law, but that they remain set apart and segregated from the nations who dwelt in the land of Canaan. He knew that any interactions they had with the various people groups that occupied the land would end up in the compromising of their convictions. They would be turned away from serving God alone. God knew that the greatest threat to His people was not the military might of the inhabitants of Canaan, but the presence of their false gods. The Israelites didn't need to worry about succumbing to the superior strength of their foes, but of falling for their false gods. Because if that happened, they would find God to be their enemy. And He made it very clear what would happen if they disobeyed His law or failed to remain faithful to Him as their God. Because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and lacking everything. And He will put a yoke of iron on your neck until He has destroyed you. Deuteronomy 28, verses 47 through 48. And yet, in spite of all these warnings, Joshua and the people of Israel quickly found themselves in a situation where their commitment to God's law was put to the test. Because of their growing reputation as a powerful force to be reckoned with, the people of Gibeon decided to do something to protect themselves against this growing threat. They devised a plan to deceive Israel into making an alliance with them. They were smart enough to recognize that Israel was on a search and destroy mission, having completely annihilated both Jericho and Ai. They weren't simply defeating their enemies, they were eliminating them. And the people of Gibeon knew that they would be next unless they did something. That Israel would make an alliance with one of the nearby nations who occupied the land was highly unlikely, so the Gibeonites devised an elaborate ruse that allowed them to appear as if they had traveled from a distant land in search of an alliance with the Israelites. They knew that if they could trick the Israelites into making an alliance or peace treaty with them, that it would bind them permanently, even after the truth of their deception became known. The treaty, once signed, would become an unbreakable agreement between the two nations, effectively preventing Israel from obeying God's command to destroy all the nations of the land. And the most revealing and regrettable lines in this passage are found in verses 14 and 15. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them, and made a covenant with them, to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore to them. Joshua 9, verses 14 through 15. The Israelites took the bait. They bought the lie, all because they didn't take the matter to God. They made a cardinal mistake. They listened to the lies of the enemy and didn't seek the wisdom of God. Joshua made peace with the Gibeonites, signing a binding covenant that would eventually place the people of Israel in the awkward position of having to put their allegiance to the people of Gibeon ahead of their allegiance to God. Joshua got taken. He got bamboozled by the enemy and fooled into making an alliance that had been expressly forbidden by God. His failure to seek God's counsel resulted in him breaking God's law. He listened to the lies of the enemy and heard what he wanted to hear. The alliance seemed like a good idea at the time, but would one day come back to haunt him. And it all could have been prevented had Joshua sought the counsel of God. It's interesting to note that the people of Gibeon met Joshua at the Israelite camp at Gilgal. So the people of God had left Mount Ebal and returned to their original location. They had left the altar and the law behind, both literally and figuratively. They had met with God at Mount Ebal, but now they were back at Gilgal, and Joshua's actions indicate that he neglected to make seeking God a permanent and pervasive part of his daily experience. Worshiping God at the altar is worthless if you're going to abandon his influence over your life when you leave the altar.